Hi, good day to everybody. It's either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you're from all over the globe joining us, which is the wonderful good thing about Zoom. I am Deborah Isaac. I'm the president of the American Zionist Movement. The American Zionist Movement is an umbrella organization of 41 Jewish Zionist organizations working across a broad ideological, religious, and political spectrum, linking the entire Jewish community with Israel, Zionism, and the entire Jewish people. AZM is the Zionist Federation in the United States of the World Zionist Organization. We of course, as do close relationship with Israel, and as we prepare for elections here in the United States, there's actually before us will be elections in Israel, which for some of us is sometimes kind of confusing, and there's a lot always going on in those elections. So we have with us today some experts to help us on that note. So a few housekeeping items before we get into the substance. You are all muted, but you can ask questions in the Q&A feature on your screens. Everyone is welcome to put in questions, and we will try to get to as many of them as time allows after we hear from ours. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available for those. Who don't get who may not have made it after a few hours after we finish today. Okay, now on to our program. We're hoping to be able to give a few insights into what is going to be happening next week in Israel and what's happening in the lead up to the elections. We have with us two journalists who are both experts in this regard, both of whom are Americans who made Aliyah, and so could probably see both sides of the perspectives. Gil Hoffman, who is executive director of Honest Reporting and former chief political correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. Carrie Keller-Lynn, sorry, I got that backwards, political correspondent for the Times. Carrie Keller-Lynn, I don't know why I want to say it backwards, is the political correspondent of the Times of Israel. Covering the Knesset. Carrie also has reported on the Russian invasion in Ukraine, both from Ukraine and from Poland. She's formerly was with McKinsey & Company and applied her background to strategy and policy implementation in the Israeli Health Ministry, in particular in the fight against COVID, which was a big battle. After completing her JD MBA at Stanford, she focused on opportunities for disadvantaged communities and pro boners, and previously served as an Israeli military liaison to the Egyptian army, and holds a BA in philosophy from Yale. Gil Hoffman is the executive director of Honest Reporting, which fights for Israel in the international mainstream media and social media, is a lecturer on political strategy at the Israel College of Management, and served as chief political correspondent and analyst for the Jerusalem Post for 24 years. He's interviewed every major figure across the Israeli political spectrum, has been interviewed by top media as a regular on CNN, Al Jazeera, and other news outlets. Raised in Chicago, graduated Western University School of Journalism, wrote for the Miami Herald and Arizona Republic before moving to Israel, soldier in the IDF spokesperson's unit, and has lectured in every major English-speaking country in the world, more than half of the Canadian provinces, and apparently now has made it to all 50 US states, which is a big accomplishment, but is now living in Jerusalem. So I'm going to open up with sort of a general question to both. Broad strokes, what do we as diaspora Jewish leaders need to know about this? Who has the best chances of putting together a government? And will we be here in 18 months talking about this again? Carrie, I'm going to turn to you first.
Debbie, I think you summed it up so well. We are speaking tonight 5 days out from the Israeli election, but really possibly 6 months out from the sixth election since 2019. And unfortunately, this fifth election is shaping up to be very similar to the four that preceded it. It is once again not about Israel's skyrocketing cost of living. It's not about security. It's not about relations with our neighbors. And despite the fact that we signed a historic treaty with Lebanon today to secure a part of our maritime border, it's really not about any of these issues. It's once again a referendum on whether or not former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the head of the Likud party, should come back and be our prime minister. And why do I say this? Issues are much more interesting and tangible to talk about, but what's really being discussed by politicos and the nightly news shows is what I like to think of as almost lunch table politics. It's who you'll sit with, because fundamentally in the Israeli system, it's not about winning at the ballot box. It's about being able to form a government the day after, because none of our parties win a majority of the 61 seats in our 120 seat Knesset in order to form a government. We need to form them together. So let's talk about the blocks and why these blocks are all having trouble forming a potential government. So let's start with the Likud bloc that's headed by Netanyahu, Bibi. This bloc, he's very explicitly said, would be a right-wing religious bloc that would include the far-right party, Religious Zionism, Jewish Power, as well as the two Haredi parties. Bibi's been consistently polling between 55 and 60 seats. He's inched up towards that 61. Only a few polls see him at that 61, but is far from being secure. So rather than really running on the issues, Netanyahu, like the other candidates at this point, are running on two kind of unsexy technical hallmarks of the election. And one is voter turnout. And the second is this idea called the electoral threshold, which really determines who can or can't sit in the Knesset. So voter turnout. Why is this so key to the Likud? Because between the third election and the fourth election, the one held in 2020 and the one in 2021, Likud lost something like 21% of its voters. 285,000 Israelis decided not to come in and vote for Likud. And had they shown up, there would be a right religious government, perhaps still running Israel today without the need for this fifth election and possibly the ones to come. However, Likud voters were not motivated, and so that's why so much of the pressure has been here. The second area, thresholds. In Israel, you need to get something like 3.25% of the vote in order to make it into Knesset. That's 4 seats. And in order to guarantee that he would not lose any seats on the right, that all of the votes that were cast for one of his bloc mates would make into the Knesset, Netanyahu, for the second time, has kind of stitched together this alliance between far-right parties, Religious Zionism, and Jewish Power. Its leaders, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, and has really helped the rise of Itamar Ben-Gvir, someone who is seen as a figure who could really rewrite what Israeli politics look like, especially in terms of these questions of what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be democratic as a state, and really mainstreaming this kind of neo-Kahanism, Kahana being a politician who was banned from Israeli Knesset for far-right and racist views in the 80s, whether or not this would come back to power. So this was kind of crafted as a threshold question, but the threshold issue that's still kind of staring Netanyahu in the face is whether or not Jewish Home leader Ayelet Shaked, she's our current interior minister, she's our former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's longtime political partner, whether or not she'll stick in the race, because right now she's not projected to win. And if she stays in, she's likely to burn votes for his side. So the big questions facing Netanyahu and his bloc are not the big issues. It is, will voters come out and vote? And will Ayelet Shaked stay in the race? Lapid's side. Lapid leads this kind of center-left bloc. He himself leads a center-left party. It's called Yesh Atid, but his bloc's a little bit more varied. It has many features of this outgoing change government. It has parties on the left. It has centrist parties. It probably has a center-right party headed by Benny Gantz. And it also has likely a Islamist party in it called Ram that sat in the last coalition. Lapid's problem is that he has no way of forming a government, at least that he's been able to articulate this entire 4-month election season. And this is really what his political opponents have come out against him for. Lapid doesn't have a clear way to get to that 61 seats. He's polling around 56, because remember, there's also a third bloc, sort of a non-aligned bloc of Arab parties who won't sit with either side, and so take seats out of the coalition game. And so Lapid doesn't have a way of getting there, but what he can do is block. So what Lapid's trying to do is amass enough power to take the 61 possibility from Netanyahu and block and bide his time until a sixth election that could happen in May, where circumstances might change. Netanyahu might be forced to step down and kind of end this question. And why are we so frozen in this stalemate? Why is it this case? And I'll stop here. It's because the question of Netanyahu has left Israel in a situation in which we have an ideological right-wing majority. We have something like 70 right-wing members of Knesset sitting in Knesset today. We have something like 70, 75 that are polling to make it into Knesset, but only 55 to 60 will sit with Netanyahu. And that difference of that 55 to 60 to the 70, 75, that difference between the ideological right-wing majority and the political one is unfortunately why Israeli politics will be going to polls again on Tuesday and perhaps again in May.
Thank you for your comments, and you definitely previewed some of the questions that I will have going forward. But Gil, why don't you give us your view on this more general outlook on the elections, and then we'll get into some specifics.
Thank you so much to Deborah, to all the organizers of this event, and to the participants who I know so many of. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And I appreciate Carrie and her brilliant analysis. It was a pleasure to work with her. This election is our fifth in 3.5 years. To put this into perspective, my daughter, who will be turning 6 the day after the election, I always take her to vote. Counting the elections for mayor of Jerusalem, she's going to be voting for a 7th time before she turns 6. And how will this end, you asked, Deborah? Well, I tend to avoid making predictions, but I'd say that there's about a 50% chance that Netanyahu will get that 61 that he needs in order to be able to form a government. I'd say there's about a 25% chance that you could have another election, a 6th election. It would obviously be very embarrassing for Israel around the world. And a 25% chance that we have the following scenario. Okay, so elections are decided in Israel. Unlike in baseball, they're decided not during the season, they're decided in the preseason or in the postseason. There were a lot that happened before the lists were set that went in Netanyahu's way, so he won the preseason. And now we're getting to there'd be the postseason after the election takes place. And there, Isaac Herzog is the one who decides who gets to form a government as the president. So if Netanyahu doesn't get 61, or if he does, he would get the first chance of forming a government, because by law, the president can ask anyone on this piece of paper of members of Knesset to form a government. But by tradition, they ask the leader of the largest bloc, the leader usually of the largest party, the person who gets the most recommendations of who could form a government. And that's Netanyahu on all counts, whether he gets that magic 61 or not. And he'd fail if he doesn't get the 61. Then Lapid, who's only 4 seats behind in the polls, he would get the second chance to form a government. And chances are he would fail, though I didn't think he'd be able to form a government last time. You never know what he has up his sleeve. So after they both fail, it's already January 2023 here. And that's when Benny Gantz would turn to the religious parties and say, do you want to keep Lapid and Avigdor Lieberman, the finance minister who hates you so much, in power? Or do you want to take unlimited money from me and allow me to form a government? And that could happen. It's a 25% chance, I'd say. I agree with Carrie on what will decide the election that's before the postseason. Your threshold of seeing which parties make it there, with 4 parties teetering on the threshold according to the latest polls, which happens because we have 38 parties running in this election. Imagine the culture shock for me coming from Chicago, where there's only one party. And of course, the turnout which again, imagine the culture shock. You had 70% turnout among the Jews. In Chicago last election for mayor, there was 23% turnout, and half those people were dead, and the other half were voting twice. So here, the Arab turnout is what's fluctuated between 45 and 65%. That'll go a long way toward deciding the election. The last thing that'll decide the election are the swing voters. Now, who are they? In the 96 election, it was very clear. Netanyahu versus Peres. They both went to the center. Netanyahu's slogan was Netanyahu osim shalom batuach. He talked about making peace. And Peres' slogan was Israel chazaka im Peres. He talked about strength. Last election, Naftali Bennett, he was the only one who did not join either camp. He held the swing voters so he could decide who forms a government, and he decided on himself, even though he had only 6 seats. This time, you all know a lot of Israelis. Do you know anyone who doesn't have an opinion on Netanyahu? There aren't any swing voters, but there are what I call stability voters, people whose top priority is ending this chaos, and they too are divided. Some will say, I don't like Bibi, but he has the best chance of forming a government. Just let him do it. And others will say, we need to get rid of him. Whoever can best get rid of him will get the support of those people. Now, this election will then have a big impact on the way Israel is seen in the world. There's going to be a lot of people who say that Israel's regressing or becoming racist. And the truth is, it couldn't be further from the truth. There are political developments, there are technical developments that are responsible for certain things happening. And Israelis are not becoming more racist. It's very important that people understand what's really going on. And that's why I really appreciate you giving us this opportunity to explain it. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you both for your comments, and both from my own questions and from things that are coming in now from people who are watching or who sent in before. You both focused also a little bit on the structure of the election process, how that's affecting both this election and I guess the four are sort of in this situation. Could you address whether there would be any reforms in the making coming forward? Because that's a question that's definitely been on my mind, and other people are asking the same thing. Would the Knesset possibly do anything to make those reforms so that we're not in a situation, or is that not a possibility? Who wants to take that?
Have to, oh, sorry. Just very quickly, the answer is no. No credible reforms are being discussed, especially not at the Knesset level. Debbie, as you might imagine, it's very hard to change a system that enables you yourself to be in power. The incentives aren't aligned, and I don't think there's even a real civil society consensus as to what change should specifically be made, although this is a perennial question in the Israeli political sphere.
And just to add some historical perspective to that, Israelis are scarred and traumatized by previous reforms. The reform that there was ahead of the 96 election and instituted direct elections for prime minister weakened the largest parties, because the smaller parties said that it's a waste of a vote to vote for Likud and Netanyahu, or the left and Peres. One party said it's like putting bread in your pita. Why do that when you could put something exciting in your pita? There was an attempt in 2009, a very serious attempt to change the electoral system, have half the Knesset elected by direct regional elections and half continue the way we do now, which is the way it is in Germany. And 90 members of Knesset were in favor of this reform. But by tradition, not law, the parties that are part of the governing coalition could block changes in the basic law, the bills that are the forerunner to a constitution that may never be written. The ultra-Orthodox, they blocked it. They said they like the current system. It serves them well. And that minority defeated the huge majority of 90 out of 120.
That's pretty amazing. I think that threshold to get into the Knesset that allows you to get in with such small numbers, I think allows there to be this 38 parties now vying in that with this, but none of them would vote to let themselves be kept out.
The threshold, I believe, is actually at its highest level. It was raised within the last 5 years or so. which has actually had an interesting consequence because as the threshold's been raised, actually more votes have kind of been cast off as disqualified. And it's also created this weird dynamic. We had a piece in Times of Israel about this, I believe, last week or the week before, where most of our elections since the threshold has been raised have been decided exactly at those margins. So not, I wouldn't say the small parties are because of the threshold. I would say that the threshold's actually, it's creating pressure for parties to unite. This is why religious Zionism and Jewish Power, as well as a smaller fringe anti-LGBT party called Noam, united into one list. It's why the Arab parties, Hadash and Tal, are running together despite having somewhat disparate ideologies. And it's why a lot of our battles are now decided on the margins.
Yes, so well, that kind of gets me a little bit towards another question that I've had and that I've seen come up from others as well, is talk a little bit about the effect, the Ben Gvir effect. So Netanyahu brokered this deal between the religious Zionist and Otzma Yehudit in order to perhaps get them into coalition. What's the effect? I mean, there's a lot of writing about Ben Gvir in the political cosmos.
Can I go first?
Sure, go ahead.
So Itamar Ben Gvir, who is receiving bad press for Israel all around the world. I have to deal with my hat as the executive director of Honest Reporting now. He is someone who, as a teenager, threatened Yitzhak Rabin, and until very recently had a picture in his home of Baruch Goldstein, who massacred Arabs and was in favor of expelling Arabs from this country, undeniably racist. Now, either because he received smart political advice or because he genuinely changed, no longer says such things. He has decided to moderate his views to the point that he was described by Carrie in Times of Israel as cuddly. So only after he moderated his views did the support for him go up. And that's important to differentiate. And it's happened because of some technical reasons. First of all, we keep on talking about trauma of voters. Last time there were voters who voted for right-wing parties, and they joined a coalition with left-wing and Arab parties. So it makes sense that right-wing voters would want someone who would not defy what they were voting for. Number two, you've got a situation of ultra-Orthodox rabbis who are passing away, and their successors don't command the same blind adherence. And so these people can now vote for Ben Gvir instead of voting for the ultra-Orthodox parties. You've got terrorist attacks that there have been over the last several months that Israelis were scared of being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there was Ben Gvir interviewed right there. He's very much a media creation, which Americans know what it's like to have a politician who's a media creation. All of those things have built him up. Also, Sephardi ethnic politics. There are young Sephardim from the periphery who want to vote for somebody who looks like them. If there's any racism on the rise among Israelis that have led to Ben Gvir having more support, it's Sephardi racism against Ashkenazi. It's not Israelis becoming more racist. We facilitated the formation of a government with an Arab party just a year ago. We didn't suddenly become racist overnight. And so any media outlet, whether it's an Israeli media outlet in English that's been writing that Ben Gvir rising means Israelis are becoming more racist, or media outlets around the world, you need to tell them that it's wrong.
So can I add to that?
Yeah, sure.
Gil, I think you brought up a number of key points here, but I'd like to kind of touch on why I think support has exploded, such to the point that Ben Gvir, when he ran separately in 2020, garnered only 0.42% of the vote, less than 0.5% of the vote, something like 19,000 votes. And today he pushed Otzma to 15 seats in the polls, and about 7 to 8 of them are considered to be his personally. In the 1980s, Kahana was in Knesset before he was banned, and he was there by himself. It was before the threshold was raised. And when Kahana used to speak in Knesset, as is perfectly legal and befits a member of the Israeli Knesset, Likud used to walk out of the plenum. Likud, the largest party on the right, thought that Kahana was was not okay. It was unpalatable. It was improper to listen to him speak. He was such an untouchable. Today, you have a scenario where Likud and its leader have brought Ben-Gvir into the mainstream fold. And I think that's what's really changed. In 2020, he couldn't make it in the Knesset. In 2021, afraid that the right religious bloc would not have the seats it would need to form a government, Netanyahu forced Smotrich and Ben-Gvir together, despite the fact that they have basically very similar policy positions. They have very different audiences and very different approaches. Smotrich is much more the establishment side of the far right of the religious Zionist movement. Ben-Gvir is the anti-establishment side of it. And what Netanyahu did was he brought Ben-Gvir into the mainstream far right. And then over the course of a year and a half now of being a lawmaker and given a platform, you add in this softening of public perception, which I don't really buy, because his content is still quite the same. He still has Khanist-like remarks. And I saw there was a question about the Khanism, so I'm highlighting that here. Khanist-like remarks saying that he wants to deport disloyal Israelis, including disloyal Jewish lawmakers. He wants to deport Arabs and Palestinians, both Arab citizens of Israel and Palestinians who strike Israeli soldiers. He wants to annex the territory, the heavily Palestinian populated territory in the West Bank, but not extend citizenship to Palestinians. So our ideas of Jewish and democratic, what that means, differ across the Israeli spectrum. These are all very Khanist ideas. He has softened the language he uses. He's very smiley, he's very cuddly. The day after he went into a Palestinian neighborhood of Jerusalem, brandishing a handgun and tweeting that he's going to go there to protect Jewish citizens, he was welcomed on the second largest TV show's morning show on Friday morning and was cooking his stuffed peppers, right? He's been mainstreamed by the politics, he's been mainstreamed by the media, and I think that that's why he's much more palatable. And more than that, we've also seen members of his party. There were secret clips that were released, video clips, so we actually know this is true. Someone on his list who will make it into Knesset if they get those 15 seats said that Ben-Gvir's ideology hasn't changed, but he understands that if he were to hold on to these extremist approaches in terms of public communication, he would either have a hard time with more moderate voters who want to vote for the party, or be blocked from entering Knesset for holding extremist views, which are against the law and can disqualify you, much like they disqualified Kana.
Well, that's a very good explanation about Ben-Gvir. I'm not sure if that answers whether that helps Netanyahu ultimately to have Ben-Gvir coalition or not, and what it does for the religious Zionist voters as well, who were the Smotrich voters.
Well, historically, Netanyahu has made a point of leaving the most right-wing party out of the coalition and sought left and centrist fig leaves, whether it's been Peres, Livni, Barak, Gantz. So there's no guarantee that he would form a government with a religious Zionist party, even though he says he would. What a politician says before an election is no proof of what he'll say afterward. But this election's different. Netanyahu's on trial. And no doubt Netanyahu wants to get out of the trial. And the religious Zionist party is in favor of taking legal steps that could help Netanyahu avoid prosecution. So why wouldn't he want them?
And
So
very explicitly, I just want to add to what Gil said. In addition to certain judicial reforms that would be broader structural changes that could lead to Netanyahu getting out of his trial, very explicitly, Bezalel Smotrich, the head of religious Zionism, presented a legal plan about a week and a half ago where he said he wanted to cancel the charge that makes up 3 of Netanyahu's 4 charges that he's currently under trial for. It's a single charge called fraud and breach of trust. Under current Israeli law, that would invalidate the trial. It would basically end it on those 3 charges. Although Smotrich and Likud have said, oh no, we will not cancel Netanyahu's trial over this. Obviously, you can take an election promise as you will.
So I was actually going to ask exactly about that, where Netanyahu's trial stands and how that affects this election. But in terms of that specific party, they're saying that they would get him out of his troubles. Others, maybe not. What do you think?
One thing I would add is, of course, so Netanyahu did not take a plea deal when it was offered to him in January of this year. He spent weeks agonizing and causing the Israeli media and voters alike to agonize, will he or won't he? Because if he were to take the deal, it would have included a clause that would have set him out of politics for 7 years and functionally ended the 73-year-old leader's tenures as, you know, Israel's longest serving prime minister. He didn't take the deal. And while Netanyahu does not speak publicly about judicial reform, which he has very close associates within the party, including his number 2 in the party right now, Yariv Levin, who speaks openly about these issues. So we can intuit a little bit about where the party would head from that. And the party is very strongly behind some of the structural judicial reform initiatives taken, but the party will not say anything about actually canceling the trial. Certain MKs have said the trial should be paused. It's a bad trial, but whenever that happens, there's some strong policing to not at least message publicly from Netanyahu's voice that he wants to cancel his trial.
I would just add that the legal system in Israel works very slowly. Got 300 witnesses in this trial. They haven't gotten to witness number 20 yet. We might have 4 more elections before this trial becomes something that it will really have an impact on the election. But what it does is it unites the people against him. We're very worried that he would make changes that would harm Israeli democracy irrevocably. That's what can bring together that concern people with such different views to form the most diverse government, not only in the history of Israel, but possibly in the history of mankind, with the right wing and left wing and everywhere in between, and very orthodox and very secular and everywhere in between, LGBT and homophobic, and an Arab party for the first time. That's all because of concern for Israeli democracy, because of the changes that Netanyahu could make in order to avoid prosecution. And that has changed Israeli politics in a way that makes it, I think, very interesting.
Well, you know, first of all, everything works very slowly in Israel, anything that has a bureaucratic piece to it. But besides that, you lead me into another area that has been an area that people have questions about, and that is talk a little bit about the Arab parties. We had Ram in the last coalition, which, you know, from my perspective, I think was very well received in the diaspora for sure, elsewhere as well. But you know, where do they stand now? What are the chances that there'll be one of those parties in the government going forward after this election?
If I can go first.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Mansour Abbas, what he did by joining a government was revolutionary. Credit, I think, goes to the Abraham Accords, where the premise was that the Arab and Muslim world no longer has to wait for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be solved in order to establish ties with Israel. Well, when that happened, Mansour Abbas said, if they're not waiting anymore in Bahrain and Dubai, why are we waiting in Nazareth and Al-Fahim? And so there was legitimacy for cooperating with an Israeli government and helping their constituency. I said to Wolf Blitzer on CNN the night that the government was formed that Jewish towns and Arab towns don't look the same. And that's not because of racism. It's because bad politics. All along, no Arab party was willing to join a governing coalition where they divide up the spoils. And here it happened. Mansour Abbas took up an Arab party into the government and got allocations of 50 billion shekels to allocate for building up the infrastructure in the Arab towns. Schools looking better, inter-Arab crime, that could have a huge positive effect. But it's been only a year. That is not enough time for voters to feel in their pocketbooks that there was a difference. Despite all our political instability, we had the same transportation minister for 10 years in a row. So he could start building a train or a highway and finish it. And everyone who lives around that train or highway knows that it's because of him that they get to work half an hour early every day. Nobody could say that about Mansour Abbas yet. And so because of that, he won't necessarily be rewarded at the polls. Now, Arab voters, They love it when their parties unite. When the threshold was raised, it was by Avigdor Lieberman to try to get rid of Arabs from the Knesset. Instead, they united, and it worked. They got 65% turnout. They got 15 seats. Then when they ran in two parties, they were mad at them, their voters. Went down to 45%. Well, now they're running in three parties. And statistically, if you've got 1 million Arab voters, 450,000 votes you would need for three parties with a minimum threshold of about 150,000 votes. It's not going to happen, apparently. And so at least one party doesn't make it in, possibly two parties don't make it in. If you go down from having 15 Arab seats to having only 5 in a year and a half, the world's going to be saying, look at how terrible Israel is. And you'll have to explain that why it's not true.
Carrie, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I don't know about the consequence of blaming Israel. I think that is a interesting perspective. I'm much more focused on the immediacy of if one or two Arab parties, well, let's start with this. One is expected not to make it in. Balad, the Palestinian Nationalist Party, which peeled off from Hadash and Tal, is not expected to cross into the Knesset, but it will burn along with it maybe 1 to 2% of the vote. The two remaining parties, Ram has expressed its willingness to again sit with a coalition led by Lapid, even Gantz, has said it has some issues now with the Likud, although in the past it said that the dream would be to be taken in by the Likud and basically koshered by the Likud. Hadash and Tal are not expected to sit with the coalition. Both Hadash and Tal and Lapid have said that that is not something in the cards. Again, election promises, let's see what happens. But the key point about Hadash Tal not being willing to sit with either side of the coalition, again, it's that third wedge. And the size of that wedge, if it's 4 seats, 5 seats, or 0 seats, will very much affect the size of both Lapid and Netanyahu's blocks. If Hadash Tal does not make it into the Knesset, then we might see a very clear path to victory for Netanyahu.
So that's very interesting. And I met Mansour Abbas, and I was very impressed with him, actually, and what he was able to do. And you were talking about, Gil, about the fact that there was some improvement in the lives of Arab Israelis during this, from what them. What can we talk a little bit about what the changes, what would possibly happen in the election, how that affect the life of all Israelis in the country, and things like transportation and health and just financial well-being, etc. How is this election likely to affect Israelis in those ways?
Wow, Deborah, you're the first person to ask about that, including the 9 million voters in Israel. They're not talking about that. They're really talking about that pathetic Shakespearean cliche of to be or not to be. That's really been the only question. Just to start with Mansour Abbas, to segue there, he told me when the government formally unveiled all the plans to help the Arab sector, he told me in that press conference at the Knesset, I'm in the government and I'm never leaving. We're going to be here forever. And look, Netanyahu says that he won't let them be in the government. So they'd be in the coalition or supporting from the outside. Either way, if he has a narrow coalition, he's not going to turn away another 5 seats who would support him and help him stay in power in return for everything they'd get. And so a lot will be decided on this Arab sector. Will they be an outward partner in the government or a hidden partner in the government?
It's also, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Gil.
Please, it's okay.
I want to say it's also worth adding, this is something that it's talked about so much here that you almost forget to mention it to people who aren't, completely mired in Hebrew news. Netanyahu allegedly negotiated with Abbas to bring him into a coalition last round. Netanyahu has obviously denied this. Other people in the party have been less firm about denying this. Smotrich was recorded admitting that this happened. Mansour Abbas himself says that he has proof that this happened. So Netanyahu did allegedly actually already try to bring Ram into a coalition. It was vetoed by Smotrich. But before the election even happened, kind of in that pre-game setting up, as it was clear that that we were about to go there, members of Likud said that they would be comfortable with Ram in a coalition. They just didn't want Ram to have a decisive vote. So they wanted it to be a broader coalition, more than 61 seats, so that Ram wouldn't have the power to hold the coalition kind of in a chokehold, much like we've seen over this outgoing coalition when you only have 61, 60, 59 MKs. Each MK holds tremendous power because without a majority and with an opposition that's trying to fight you in every single corner, you're unable to really pass any legislation. And that's what directly led to this coalition falling apart. So I do think there's a lot of possibility for Ram to keep going ahead as long as Mansour Abbas keeps his base convinced that this is a process that they can invest in.
And to add to your question about education and healthcare, Deborah, the parties do want to talk about it. For instance, the Labor Party, they had a primary for number 2 on their list. It was won by a woman named Naama Lazimi. She's not known around the world. Her main issue that she promoted in her first term in the Knesset was raising the minimum wage. The fact that she was propelled to the top slot, not somebody who talks about security, not someone who talks about human rights or whatever, and making peace with the Palestinians. I think that's fascinating. Shas, the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party, their buses in Jerusalem have the slogan "Revim l'shinui," hungry for change. They focus on the poverty issue. The education minister is part of Gantz's party, and so she focuses on education issues. And COVID obviously can always come back. And so while the parties don't speak dramatically different about it, it's always present there as something that can become big again at any given point.
So based on that, talk a little bit about how talk a little bit about how a coalition gets formed, how it will become a government from time frames, and what's going to happen in the country in the meantime while all of that is going on. I mean, we've been in kind of a little bit of holding, then not holding, then not holding. But for those people who may not understand the process as well, could you talk a little bit about how does that do for the functioning of the country?
Gil, you've seen this, 10 times? You want to take it?
Gil, you've seen this. No problem. Look, yes, our job, the job that I had until recently and Carrie's job that she has now, is not so much to report about what the politicians do when they're serving the people. You've got other beats at the Jerusalem Post and Times of Israel for that. We write, and I wrote about when the politicians deal with helping themselves. That's where the focus goes. Elections cost a tremendous amount of money. A lot gets on hold. Bills that legally have to be passed by the Supreme Court have waivers that say, well, if there's an election coming up, then it gets delayed by 3 months. They've been trying to pass drafting yeshiva students for several years now, and they keep on having delays extended and the elections get in the way. So how long will this take? Well, okay, so the election is November 1st. Take out your Google calendars here, ladies and gentlemen. November 8th, Isaac Herzog will appoint somebody to form a government, give that person 4 weeks with a possible addition of 2 more weeks. If Netanyahu gets 61, then sometime by the 6th of December, he'd form a government. If he does not have 61, then he might ask Herzog for more time. He won't get it. Okay, so now it's November 8th, a couple days after that. After more consultations, President Herzog asks Lapid to form a government. Okay, so he gives him 4 weeks. We're now already up to the 5th of January. He fails. He didn't form a government. Consultations again, and this time the president isn't directly involved. You have a 3-week period in which anybody by law can form a government with a deadline of, we're already up to the 26th, 1926 of January. And if you don't form a government by that 26th of January, no one, then elections are automatically initiated on the first Tuesday after 90 days. And so now I can't really do that math very well, but it's around Passover, and fun.
Yeah, that would be in March. And in the meantime, right, the minimum kind of this like limited ability to do anything. Is that not correct? Am I getting that? Is that not correct? Am I getting that
Right,
right?
they can't do very much. By the way, April 25th is what would seem to be the next date for the election. Well, no, that's Yom HaZikaron. Can't do that then.
It's going to be in May, right?
May 2nd.
I did this math last week, and we got to May.
Yom HaTzmaut, you have all kinds of things going on, and we're not moving. Yeah, so which is a little bit disappointing, I think, for everybody, because we need the government to keep functioning.
So I want to say something about the government functioning, because while we're definitely frozen on long-term strategic planning, actually, let me put it this way. You think of the Maslowian pyramid of the hierarchy of needs, right? Israel's very good at keeping its base level needs going. We don't have any problems with security. Major things that need to be taken care of are found a way to be taken care of. Where we're not succeeding is long-term planning and being able to set a real vision or direction. On the security front, we fought a short operation in Gaza this summer, right after Lapid became prime minister. We signed, again, the Lebanon agreement today, so we were able to make an international treaty with a country in which we have a state of war active. So we're able to really take care of the big things. Israel's not in danger because of the elections. However, on the other hand, we only have a budget that's been passed through the end of 2022. Before this budget was passed at the end of 2021, we had 3 years where we didn't have a budget. I was at the Ministry of Health briefly during that time. It's very hard to get anything done without a budget. We came up with an exceptions committee process, but it meant you had to talk to the Ministry of Finance every time. It was a huge bureaucratic layer that was added to everything. It means that new hospitals aren't getting budgets. It means that things aren't being built. It means that large infrastructure projects maybe aren't being planned out. The country still operates, but is not really achieving its state of, self-actualization, let's say.
Well, I've definitely found that I've come into some of those not being able to move on educational things and building and all those kinds of things. So it's a little trying, and I don't even live in Israel, and so I'm sure more for people who do that it can be difficult. You touched on one thing that I do want to ask about, and that is the Israel-Lebanon agreement that was recently signed, and what that means for this upcoming election as well. So who would like to tackle that one first?
I'm happy to. Netanyahu has put himself forward as the statesman. When there was a possibility of the US returning to an Iran deal earlier this summer, Netanyahu went on a fierce public relations blitz, accusing Lapid and Defense Minister Gantz of being late on Iran, of unable to block this bad deal. And ultimately the deal wasn't signed. I don't believe it was necessarily to Lapid's full credit, as he might want you to believe. But with the Lebanon deal, something similar happened. Netanyahu came out very strongly against this deal, said that it was illegal, that you needed to have Knesset ratification of the deal, or at least, how do you say Mishal Am? Referendum, a national referendum. Turns out you don't need that because it's not technically Israel's territorial waters. It was only waters of economic interest, according to UNCLOS, which is the international treaty that governs the law of the seas. However, Netanyahu's kind of come back on that language, whereas in the past he said that he would not be bound by this deal, that they would cancel this deal. Now that the deal's been signed, in the approach the week leading up to the deal being signed, the language has softened. They said that they would fix the deal. I don't think it's going to be a huge election issue. I think Lapid wanted to make this a big feather in his cap. I think Netanyahu wanted to accuse Lapid of not having responsible statesmanship. And frankly, I don't think this is what's going to move the needle because, again, as both Gil and I have been saying, this election is not about issues. It's about who you think has a better chance of forming a government.
Gil, do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what the deal does is it makes it unlikely we're going to be attacked by Hezbollah between now and Tuesday. And if we were going to be attacked by Hezbollah between now and Tuesday, it would help Netanyahu because in every election since he entered politics, when there have been security tensions ahead of the election, it's helped Israelis move to the right. It's funny. I've seen it happen time and time again. When Israelis are asked what issue they vote on most before the election, they always say the economy, the cost of living. And either they're lying or they change their mind. But when they're asked after the election what they voted on the most, they say security. And Netanyahu, I don't take a side, so you can fill in the blanks. Netanyahu has either brainwashed or convinced Israelis with his superior persuasive abilities that he and only he can make them feel safe. And all the attempts to prove that other people can keep us secure, running 3 generals on one list in the top 5 before in the blue and white party, it didn't work. Bennett and Lapid both proved they can speak English to the UN too. But it's not good enough. Netanyahu, Israelis respect experience more than voters in America and other countries do. And Netanyahu by far is the most experienced of any politician that could run in Israel, except if Moses came back between now and Tuesday.
Carrie, let me ask both of you. Actually, I'm gonna say on these issues, and you're talking about how Gil, you mentioned that people will tell you that they're going to vote on economics, but then they vote on security issues. Do you think that there's any differentiation between the generations and how they vote on these things in different demographic groups, or is this sort of just generally that's how it works for everyone?
It's interesting because you said differences in generations and demographic groups, and I would say that's actually the most defining feature of determining which party someone will vote for. Routinely, you'll see that the best predictor of a party someone would vote for is their kind of socioeconomic religious identity. So yes, you would see differences there. And just I kind of want to add one interesting fact, Gil, again, this election, about 30% of Israelis say that cost of living is their top of mind issue, which is hardly surprising. Apartment costs have gone up 19%. I know that we can't complain to Americans about inflation, but 5% here hurts pretty bad, especially when salaries in Israel are below the average that they are in America. I think we're in the bottom, definitely the bottom half of OECD salaries in Israel. But what's also really interesting is that politicians already understand what Gil said. Most parties didn't even bother putting forward an economic platform. Likud was one of the big outliers there. In August, Likud put forward an economic platform. It was a little bit all over the place. It said that we're going to slash taxes and increase spending. It said that we'll create tax holidays on certain utilities and also create free education for children ages 0 to 3. So how do you fund all those things? It was never was really scrutinized because, again, elections aren't about this, and most parties haven't even bothered to put out a full economic platform. Labor only put theirs out earlier this week, a week out to the election. So again, Israeli voters, apparently not really about the issues and their substance this time.
Gil, do you want to add to that?
I think she answered it well. And
okay, I do too. We have a few minutes left, so let me ask this: something that might be of our particular audience, and that is, what do you think is the impact of Olim in any of these, in the elections or in their viewpoints? And certainly now you have a big influx of Ukrainians and Russians who are coming in. They may not actually yet be able to vote in this particular election, but what is their impact on, on the state and on the electoral process there?
Deborah, I wish the parties took immigrants more seriously. At the Jerusalem Post, all those years, whenever any immigrant from any English-speaking country in the world ran, we highlighted them as our hometown kid and wrote about them all the time, regardless of what party they were from. And party after party, when Anglos run as immigrants from English-speaking countries, they didn't do very well. And in this election too, they were for the most part sidelined, with the Likud as an exception. They have a slot reserved for an immigrant at number 33 on the list. It wasn't won by a Russian immigrant or an Ethiopian immigrant, which could have helped the Likud. It was won by an immigrant from Canada, out of all places. Danny Luz from Montreal is the Likud's candidate.
We didn't even get him.
He speaks English and French. Good point. Look, in the Religious Zionist Party, an immigrant from Kansas, out of all places, he finished almost last when they had their first primary. The worldly people who ran in Labor and Merits did terrible. Nachman Shai, our diaspora affairs minister, was moved way down the list. It's kind of sad. Even in Yesh Atid, the Philadelphia-born Moshe Turpaz, raised by British parents, is the second to last out of any current MK on the list. So I wish they'd take us more seriously.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of good legislation or even regulations that were helpful for Olim. But Carrie, do you want to give us anything on that before we sum up here?
We're not their audience.
Not there.
Just as a word about being an English language journalist covering politics during an election season, you get a call from the politicians and spokespeople who have spent time abroad, who have an English base because they see the world as their community. They're looking for a larger platform, but it's even hard. You have to really chase some of the folks who don't, because again, these elections are very Hebrew-centric. Olim don't have a large percentage of the vote. They're scattered across parties. And more than that, you mentioned that influx of Ukrainian and Russian refugees is actually mostly Russian. I believe there were about 40,000 in total. That's about a mandate, that's about a seat. And according to the Ministry of Interior, about half of them aren't currently in the country. So it's about half a seat. So I don't think that they'll move the needle, for better or for worse. And I, of course, would always be in favor of more of consideration and more representation for Olim in Israel.
Well, on that note, I'm going to thank both of you for being here with us. I want to thank the audience who's joined us today, listening in. I think it's been very helpful and very elucidating. Your points and were really very helpful. And I hope that things go well in this election so that a government is formed. That's what I mean by go well. Just let's get a government in there, and that we'll not be back here having this conversation in the short term, and maybe we can talk about something else. So again, thank you both for being here with us and we very much, again, this has been recorded, so you can let people know who weren't able to join us that they can listen to this later. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody, or evening.